Welcome back to Beautiful Work, Beautiful Life. We are here talking all things inner work, inner life, and we like to think of all this stuff as beautiful work to create your beautiful life. And we have experienced that for ourselves. And so we like to promote that in the world. And we are really interested in gathering community who want to do work together because, well, I don't know about you, Laurel, but I think it's just the more beautiful way to do the work.
It's a more beautiful way to do the work and to live your life, right? I mean, does a beautiful life always include community?
I
In
think
my
it,
world, it does.
I think it does of some kind. I mean, I have
Yeah.
clients who prefer, animals over people. Their company, it
Yes,
just pleases them more, but that's still a community to
absolutely.
me. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we just wrapped up a month in October of talking and focusing on rituals and practices, and we have jumped into this month of which is currently November of 2023 when we're putting this out to you, sending it all out to you, and we're focusing on nourishment. And I would say that it's a good follow up to rituals and practices because there's a lot of practice, ritual, habitual routine around nourishment. And sometimes they're not so good habits and sometimes they're not so good practices. And so we're here to help you hopefully take a look at that and make some positive changes and improve things a little on that department, right?
Yeah. It's a word that I think I've started using a lot, thinking about nourishment, feeling nourished, right? And
Yeah.
it changes just how maybe my expectations, right?
Mm.
It brings a new level of what it is I want to feel. Like feeling nourished is just so beautiful.
It is. And we're going to talk about kind of the opposite of that today, aren't we? We're going to dig
We
into
sure are.
this topic, which is the pain of overindulgence. Laurel, do
Yes,
you know about that? I do.
absolutely. Right.
You.
And
Yeah.
it ties in for me with consumption. And this is another word I use a lot. I think, and I've talked about this, I think about, all that I consume, all of the consumption I practice, whether it's through my five senses, right? It could
Yeah.
be food, but it also could just be noise. It could be, information. It could be maybe even something I'm feeling tactile, right?
Yeah.
Something I'm touching. And so when I think about overindulging, often the first thing that comes up to me is food. But I know I've been known to overindulge in maybe television, right? You
Yeah.
know,
Yep.
um, maybe music at a volume that is over consumption.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that I put into that overindulgence
Yeah,
category.
that's great. That's great. I feel like one of the things that I think I've been really highly aware of since I've had tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears for people that don't know about that, is paying attention to the things that affect my nervous system and even on a very subtle level. So I think of the internet, as being
Yes.
an area of consumption that we don't always think about in that way, that we can overindulge in, that really can be harmful to us and it be painful. Yeah.
Yes. Can we talk for a
Yeah.
minute about the word indulgent or
Yes. Ooh,
indulgence,
indulgent.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So when I think about, indulgence without overindulgence, but
Yeah.
indulgence again is like, it's a treat. It's something that could be nourishing. It's something that is lovely or adds, beauty to your life, right?
Yeah.
And I think about maybe, if I take a bubble bath, it feels indulgent, right? Self-indulgent. Like how am I spoiling myself? How am I treating myself really good? Um, and that fine line between overindulgence. And I'm going to use the example of the bubble bath still.
Yeah.
If I if I take a bubble bath every night, it's no longer special,
Yep.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever I do too much of, it takes away I don't know, the specialness of it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think this is what I try to remind myself with the over, overconsumption, overindulgence, right? Like overindulging.
Yeah.
There's that fine, it's a tipping point, that fine line between what with is good and what is too much.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like I remember when I was studying a lot of Chinese medicine, when I was teaching Tai Chi and taking Tai Chi and just really into a lot of the Eastern philosophy. And one of the let's see, what do they call them? They call them pernicious evils. So, overindulging is a pernicious evil, and too much joy is in that category as well, right? So,
Yeah.
and it made me really stop and think. Of course, I wasn't overindulging in joy at all at that point in my life. So it didn't make sense to me at all. I thought, how could anybody overindulge in joy? I mean, come on. But now I do realize that if you have any too much humor, too much joy, all the things that we really enjoy about life that can be very joyful, too much of it, again, is like, when does the nervous system get to actually relax, recuperate, reset, refresh, recover, right, from the energy that tends to be extreme? And so that's a great example, because it doesn't
Yeah.
seem possible that that would be evil or difficult or painful to your system, but it can be. Yeah.
Right. And that makes sense when you think that your nervous system, you know, when something happens so frequently that it no longer causes a blip in your nervous system, it becomes the ordinary or the
Yeah.
expected. Like I can see where that might be a nervous system problem.
Right. Right. I always think of that as there was a saying that it was a phrase that was so beautiful, and I saved it for a really long time. I mean, I had 10 or 20 years where I had this little phrase sitting with all my meditation stuff, and it was something like, uh, you know, um, we as humans, our tendency, right, is to adapt. And so we'll just keep on adapting to the storm when it comes, and we won't really recognize what a danger it is, like we've put ourselves in
Yes.
real danger, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think this is what we're talking about, right? If your nervous system keeps adapting to something that is ultimately unhealthy for you, and you keep going along a track where it's intensifying, or it's more and more and more of it, then yeah, you don't even recognize some of the damage that you could be doing to yourself, and long term, not even just short term. So
Yeah.
what we're talking about here is so important, to be in touch with ourselves, to be very conscious about what our choices are. Yeah.
Yeah. As you were talking about that, sleep came to mind for me. You
Mm.
know, there are times that, I don't get enough sleep. And then a nap just feels so luxurious, right? Although I'm not a good napper, I have a hard time napping. But then if I go through a phase where, I'm sleeping more than I should, I feel that too, right? I
Yeah.
feel the downside of that. So how do you monitor, or how do you stay on top of what the perfect amount is?
The sweet spot, right?
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In anything.
Absolutely. And we come back to, you have to know thyself, right? Because what is a great 7, 8 hour sleep to me on a consistent basis gets me in good high operating function. For somebody else, could be not enough. It could be too much consistency. It could be too little. It could be anything. And so we have to really honor, and come to know what it is that helps us perform and be the way we want to exist in the world optimally. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, listening to your body, right? It is your body, at
Mhm.
least for me, that
Yeah.
gives me every clue I need, whether or not, I am getting the right amount of something. If I become bored or complacent with something, I know maybe I've overindulged,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
If I have too much of a desire for something, I think, oh, maybe I need to indulge a little more in that, right? Like it really looking for feedback
Yeah.
from, my mind, my physical body, the sensations of my body, even my emotions are good clues about, am I getting the proper amount of what it is I need?
Yeah. Yeah. And
Mm.
so the pain of overindulgence can be also on a bit of a spectrum, right? I mean, there could be a little bit of pain and, you're not really in touch with that, or it's enough to ignore. And so we talk about this cumulative effect too, right? Or it just dulls you in a way that you're not even aware of. And then there's the extreme of, I know like when I really overeat and my body is so uncomfortable and it takes a long time for it to like really move through me and I feel like I've recovered from it. It's painful. It
Yeah,
doesn't feel good.
no. And I think probably most people realize and have experienced that with food,
Yeah.
you know, um, but I think it happens I think about my need for time alone,
Hmm.
right? It used to be when my children lived in my home and I was a, full-time working in my career, parent of two daughters. I often felt like I didn't have enough time alone. And now that my life has changed and I have ample time alone, I do know like sometimes I overindulge in my aloneness, right? My solitude, my isolation. And I start to recognize that like if I have that resistance, um, that I am kind of reluctant to go out and be social. And then I know also the physical feelings of when I'm spending too much time alone, what that feels like, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, consuming food. I know what that feels like when I don't get enough or when I get too much, you know, all of those things.
Yeah.
So how do you, you know, um, I guess stay at that healthy place in all those areas?
Yeah. I think, for me, it's been I think it's so habitual. So much of what we do is so habitual. And if we can get ourselves into what are good, healthy routines and habits in general, that's like our foundational place to begin. And if you find that you have trouble getting there, it's hard to launch, from so it's kind of a sandy, slippery place, right? So we need to
Yeah.
have like a foundation of how do you even just begin to, and that's why we're talking about rituals and practices and why we focused a whole month on it, right? Is to really give time to reflect on and to take ownership of what are your routines, your habits, your practices? What are the ones that are serving you? What are the ones that aren't serving you? And how can you begin to really find your way into making the changes that you want to make? Because that's ultimately the goal, I think, for so many of us, right? And ideally,
Yes.
you want to avoid getting in habits that aren't good because that's the easiest way to to deal with it. Having a bad habit and having to change it is, as we know, I know, not easy. It's not
No, it is not
easy.
ezy. No.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about that, and it's not really a journaling prompt, but when we monitor, right? Like
Yeah.
our listeners, if you need to be able to track, one of the easiest ways that I do this when I track, am I in unhealthy or healthy kind of practices and rituals?
Yeah.
It's monitoring my energy, right?
Mhm. Yes.
So it really is, do I have the energy that I want and need to, as you said, to show up or to perform in the way, to function in the way that we're meant to?
Yeah.
And so using that, how can we monitor? It's not, am I too full? Did I eat too much? It's, do I have the energy, right?
Yeah.
How am I feeling, like physically, emotionally, spiritually, about whatever it is I'm partaking in?
Yeah. Yeah. And And I know being clear, like on how you want to feel in that, right? So I know, if I'm going into let's say a social gathering, right? I want to feel comfortable in what I'm wearing because I don't want to be fussing around with things, right? I want to feel like I'm calm. I'm centered in myself. I'm clear in what I'm going for. Why am I going to this thing so that I can connect with people on a level that's, fulfilling to why I'm there and hopefully support them and why they're there, right? And so it's like this sense of really being connected to how you want to feel and what your intentions are around it all. And I know for me, it took me quite a few years. Like I really feel like, and I talked about this, I focused on this in a lot of my change groups and things that I did when I was in group and in masterminds and stuff, was I had a really hard time disengaging from my husband's practices when we were eating. Right. And so I was uncomfortable in my body a lot of the time because I was overeating. I was eating too quickly. I was not really paying attention to not eating as mindfully as I normally would. And so it took me a long time because we were living alone. It was the two of us most of the time, right? Of really, I had to so focus on not keeping pace with him, right? Is like not being in hypnotic rhythm, this unconscious
Yes.
hypnotic rhythm that we get into, right? And being really conscious of doing it differently. And it took a long time to get there. It wasn't easy. And one of the things that was most helpful for me was I kept telling myself, I want to feel lighter. Like every time I'd finish, I'd feel heavier. I'd feel kind of logy. I knew that it wasn't good for my body, but I was just doing it so, automatically. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And
So,
I think,
yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Yeah.
I
I
was
mean,
going to say
it's hard to get conscious about this stuff and really like make a commitment to yourself, right? I'm going to do it differently. And I have to really pay attention in that moment. What am I doing? Yeah.
and giving yourself permission to
Yeah.
do it differently than others. And I'm so glad you
Yeah.
raised this,
Yeah. Yeah.
because what is, you know, overindulging for me may not be overindulging for someone else, right?
Yes,
And so,
absolutely.
how can you honor what you need and 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 allow someone else to honor what it is that they need, right?
Yeah.
That it doesn't mean we all are doing the same thing, or what is too much for me is too much for someone else,
Yeah.
right? And I'm thinking about Netflix.
Mm.
you know I mean,
Yeah.
I know people who can handle far more
Mm.
entertainment input than I can,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I know people that don't need as much solitude as I do, right?
Yeah.
Those are two great examples.
Yeah.
And to be able to honor what I need and create a practice or a ritual around that so that I feel good, um, is really beautiful.
It is. It
And
is.
it's hard. It's not easy.
No, not necessarily. And I think it's that conditioning too, that conditioning of what we're used to. So if we, again, are unconsciously trying to stay connected with people or trying to be, having conversations about stuff, because we want to stay connected in that way or whatever it is that we really have to pay attention to what keeps us in the pattern that we
Yes.
know ultimately we don't want to be in. What are
Yeah.
the reasons for that, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes they make sense and sometimes they don't. Like I know that that time of really making that change around my eating habits with my husband, right? It had nothing to do with him.
Right.
It wasn't like he was telling me, you have to eat as much as I do. You have to eat what I'm eating. I mean, it was never like that. It was always just me unconsciously, whatever, subconsciously, like doing the hypnotic rhythm thing at some
Yeah.
level, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I
So,
have
yeah,
a big example of that. Now,
yeah,
often we host Thanksgiving dinner at my home, and when we host, we have anywhere from 20 to 25 people, maybe 26. It is
wow.
a big gathering. And for those of you, our listeners who celebrate Thanksgiving in the United States, you know that that is a holiday of consumption, right?
Mhm.
Indulgence.
Mhm.
But years ago, I started adding side dishes to my dinner that were lighter, right? Green beans are always on my table with no sauce, no cheese, no
Mhm.
butter. Um, I do mashed cauliflower because mashed cauliflower for me is so much lighter than mashed potatoes. Um, and I still serve the other heavier dishes, but I've chosen deliberately, a fruit salad for dessert, right?
Yeah.
I still have the heavier, sweeter desserts,
Mhm.
but giving myself options that are lighter foods
Yeah.
so that at the end of my meal, I do not feel like I've overindulged. And that
Yeah.
day is a hard day not to overindulge,
It
right?
is a hard day. And oftentimes that's one of the hardest things too. If it's right there, how do we actually resist it? I do a lot better not eating sweets when they're not in my house. If they're in my house and I know they're there, it's harder to resist that, right? And so this self-control, I know for me, that's why that how do you want to feel comes into play. And that was part of it, right? Like repeating to myself before a meal, repeating to myself while planning a meal, repeating to myself, when I'm going out to eat, how do you want to feel at the end of the meal? Right. And really focusing on how I want to feel was what also helped me to change the habit of just
Yes.
unconsciously consuming. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that is so important. And I think it's really the only thing for me as well that keeps me kind of in check with whatever it is I'm consuming.
Yeah. Yeah.
Knowing how I want to feel, knowing how, based on past experience, knowing how I will feel if I take on too much, if I
Yeah.
do too much, if I eat too much, if I, experience too much. I know what that feels like.
Yeah. So let's speak into an overconsumption that I think is painful for a lot of people, and maybe women more so than men. I don't want to generalize, but I do think that I hear this more in this way than from men. But is the consumption of social media posting, and then sitting there and feeling inadequate, um, less than, my life's not as good, or whatever, right? I think that we are not paying attention enough to how this whole social media thing really makes us feel. We just are doing it automatically, thinking that we have to do it automatically because we're connecting with people. It's like if that's the only way you're connecting with people, you're going to be lonely, you're going to be sad, you're going to be disappointed, you're going to be whatever, right? I mean, real relationships are what really nourish us in the flesh and blood and in the face of other people, right? And we need that. We need that for a healthy lifestyle at some level. So, the overconsumption of social media is probably one of the most painful things that I hear about now from a lot of my clients. Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, I think that it is the scrolling, right? It's
Mhm.
the mindless scrolling, which is, mindless. It's not, you're not fully mindful of how you're engaging. You're not even engaging. You
Mhm.
are just scrolling.
Yeah.
And that leaves many people with an emptiness, with an
Yes.
empty feeling, right?
Yeah.
And it is interesting because, years and years ago, I bet I'm going to say 35 years ago, I used to get Good Housekeeping magazine
Mm.
in the paper form when magazine subscriptions were a thing. And I always felt like my house was less than.
Mm.
And my sister one day said, well, stop looking at those magazines,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You know, there are several magazines that I used to, you know, um, look at, and the portrayal of what was normal
Hmm.
in print form, because it was all pretty pictures and nice, even some magazines that came out with the beautiful texture of the paper.
I
The
know.
shape of the
Yeah.
magazine was different. The
Yeah.
colors were different.
Yeah.
So it just reminds me of, we can still do that in many ways. Social media, definitely,
Mm-hmm.
but it could be the magazines we're reading. It could be the clothing stores we're focused on,
Yeah.
like being mindful of our consumption, our where we indulge, right? And I'm going to put this um indulging in something that is not realistic or holistic, right?
Yes.
And that leads to
Yes.
the comparison. So
Yes.
if we are consuming anything that brings us to a place where we are comparing ourselves to others, where we're kind of sucked into comparison and we feel less than, then those are real good warning signs that we're overindulging in that area and we need to pull it back, right? And be
Yeah.
mindful of how we are, what practice can you put? I mean, I'm going to say this. Let's tell our listeners, you and I met on Instagram. I
Yeah.
mean, I have 3 friends I met on social media.
Yeah.
Social media can be a beautiful place to engage with people or experience people or things you've never experienced before.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
There's a lot of learning and growing and connecting that can be had.
Yeah.
But it has to be a mindful practice of how you engage in it and how you know when you are over consuming or overindulging in that area.
Absolutely. And then how do you set yourself up for success rather than failure? So, for instance, if you know that 10 minutes of scrolling is your cutoff, because after that, you're going into the zone, some zone that's not good and, whatever, then set your timer. And when that timer goes off, you get off that social media site. I mean, we come back to this, we talked about this about being a grown up in one of those shows.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Ago, right. Yeah. It's like, you have to make a decision. Like, what's more important to you?
Yes. And
Scrolling
I would,
or feeling cruddy?
right. And I would even go one step further and say,
Yeah.
don't allow yourself to scroll. Like when you think about, if you are on social media for a purpose, rather than just wasting time, it might be, well, these are where your people are. And who do you want to connect with today? Right. I mean, one really incredible, fulfilling practice is to give yourself the time to connect with 5 people each day, right?
Yeah.
On social media. So you don't scroll, you're just going, you find them, you search for them by name, you look at what their recent activity is, and you engage with them in a deliberate, intentional way. And it's amazing how much your feed changes when you are deliberate and intentional and not just scrolling.
Wow, that's powerful, Laurel. And that's also really speaks into using, social media for relationship building and real connection rather than just the empty scrolling that we're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah, that does lead to comparison and not connection. Yeah.
Yes. And, even when I think about all the other ways that we communicate now, like, we communicate by text, right?
Yeah.
We have our phones on us all the time. I carry my phone all the time.
Yeah.
I rarely talk on the phone, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't text without intention or purpose. And so if I look at social media as another means of communication to the outside world, like, what do I want to see? Do I want to see, do I want to follow what's going on in Hawaii because Hawaii is my favorite place in the universe? That, I'm not scrolling, I'm looking deliberately.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's great.
And so how, I do think, when we think about that overindulgence and the numbing feeling, right? Our nervous systems they adapt and they're so used to us engaging in some activity that no longer becomes fulfilling. It's an empty activity and we are numb, right? And the numbing of it, because it's so mundane and ordinary, our nervous system doesn't even see the joy in it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that happens.
It
right?
does.
So
It does. And the only remedy for me to replace numbing
yeah,
is sitting with yourself, feeling all your feelings, working through whatever's uncomfortable to bring yourself to a place of peace with it. Now, that sounds so simple. It's not always. It
yeah,
can be a very lengthy, involved process. It can be a mind, bending process. It can be heart wrenching at times, right? To sit through and feel your discomfort, to not be comfortable in your own skin and to find the reason why that might be there. And this is what the inner work is. And this is why it's ultimately beautiful work, because if you do that work and you feel truly good in your own skin, you don't want to numb out. Numbing out
no,
no longer feels good. It feels uncomfortable, actually.
yes.
Yeah,
So do
because
you think, go ahead,
being feels better. Yeah.
right? Of course it does.
Yeah.
And so do you think we can overindulge in the beautiful work?
Yes, I do think that you can. And here's
Really?
how. Yeah, because I think, and I've seen this with both with clients and for myself, is you tend to have a rhythm to how your work works, right? And so generally what I find with most people is you do some beautiful work, you do some inner work, and then for some period of time you kind of plateau and you integrate that work. And
Yes.
you feel like a new sense of yourself and you grow a little confident in that. And then lo and behold, maybe some new inner work shows up, some more beautiful work here to do, right? And so you might work at that for a while. And then you realize, wait a minute, I just need to just take a breath here and integrate some of what I'm doing. And I find that if we're doing it in that kind of rhythm and really integrating our work, that's when we feel the best. And that's when it feels really beautiful, right? If we're trying to do all the work too fast and too much and we're exhausted by it, that's not good either, right?
Yeah, I'm so glad you
Yeah.
mentioned that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can see that. And that's, I think that is um happens with many things. Like when we're learning something new or we discover a new hobby, we might overindulge in that, right? And our pace doesn't give us time to practice the new way of being or right, the new learning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even learning how to have, I know we've talked here a lot about, no longer people pleasing, right? Or having hard conversations, being able to have the courage to say things that you haven't said before. Um, these things take practice to get good at and to feel like you really found your voice and found your way of doing it well, right? When we do it really
Yes.
well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It takes some practice.
Yeah.
So Laura, let's just follow up here with some journaling questions before we sign off for today. I was thinking that what was coming up for me was the idea of taking some time to really honestly, brutally honestly with yourself, say to myself, where am I overindulging? Where do I know I have habits of overindulging? Right. And if you aren't able to catch it in an inventory, like an overall kind of inventory, every day, at the end of the day for maybe a month, just have a journal, where you sit down and go, okay, what did I overconsume in today? And how did it make me feel? And why did I do that? What was that about for me? How conscious was I doing that? Right? Like, was it just habitual and you weren't thinking about it? And it's hard to stop because you're not even aware of it when you're doing it. Like, really begin to notice for yourself where your patterns are in this and start to bring some, raise your consciousness around it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say if you don't know where, right, even without the awareness, but um, sometimes you might give yourself permission to spend too much time in any one area, right?
Yeah.
But I would ask, what things, what activities, what places, what people, even what foods did you used to love or enjoy more than you're enjoying now?
Mm,
Right?
yeah. Yeah.
Because when we stop and think about, I mean, I've experienced this myself. I hate to even say this out loud, but I'm going to. There are times when I walk the beach and I lose sight of how beautiful the
Sure.
place I am, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm here a lot. I'm at the ocean a lot. I walk the beach a lot.
Yeah.
It's, what do they say? Familiarity breeds contempt, right?
Mm.
I know sometimes I need to slow down, be able to bolster my enjoyment of where I am, not to go without, but to just be more present. And so maybe that journaling prompt is, what things are you enjoying less now? And how can you bring more presence and mindfulness to those activities, those things,
Yeah.
to refine, to rediscover the enjoyment that you once had? And then the question is, have you lost that sense of enjoyment because you have overindulged in that activity?
Yeah. Yeah. And could you take a break for a while, even,
Could
and
you?
do something else and replace that routine with a new routine, and just freshen things up a little bit? I
Yeah.
think, there's so many ways to approach this and to begin to explore it. And so worth it, because the pain of overindulgence is just really I don't know, it's a drag.
It's so uncomfortable.
It's so
So, so
uncomfortable.
uncomfortable.
So uncomfortable. Oh, friends, I hope that we didn't make you uncomfortable in our discussion today. But, we are here for truth telling. So
We are.
I know, I think we've got a dose of that today. Well, if you're here to the end of the podcast and you found this helpful, we would love it if you just leave us a little comment, leave us some stars, leave us a little review. We know that makes a difference in getting podcasts out in the world and getting more people to have access to them. So we invite you to take just 1 second to do that. We would appreciate it so much. And we'll be back for more, won't we, Laurel?
We will. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. All right. Have a good week, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.